It's 6 o'clock on Friday, the 27th of November. Good morning. This is Today with Justin Webb and Martha Carney.
Thank you. It is 25 to 9. We promised some answers to questions about tiers in England, and we can now bring them to you. We have questions, a lot of questions that you've emailed us, and to answer them we have Professor Tom Solomon, who's Director of the UK's Emerging Infectious Disease Research Unit at the University of Liverpool, someone we have talked to plenty of times before in the programme. Morning, Professor.
Morning, Justin.
And we're going to be joined as well, I think, by Hugh Pym, our health editor, in a moment or two's time. But let us launch first into questions about travel, about which we've had quite a few. And a simple one from Emma Burke, who says, my boyfriend lives in a Tier 2 area. I live 40 miles away in Tier 3. We are bubbled. Can we still see each other?
Thank you. Yeah, you've said it's a simple one. I want to preface this by saying that a lot of these are very nuanced questions, and the way to get answers is for people to look at the Gov UK website. So you'll read lots of things in the newspaper, but if you want to go to the source material, it's about looking at the Gov UK website and then trying to interpret what's down there. And that's what I've done. So in this case, they're bubbled. They're not saying very clearly whether they're bubbled together in the same support bubble. But if they're in one support bubble, then they are treated like one family. So it's not completely clear how they're doing that 40 miles apart. But if they are just in one bubble, and a support bubble, remember, happens when somebody is an adult on their own, living on their own, more or less, and they're then joining somebody else to make the support bubble. So if they're in one support bubble, then they are treated like one family, and they should be able to. If they're in separate bubbles with other people, then that's harder, and I don't think they should be if they're following the rules strictly.
Right, I see. So but provided it is just a bubble with each other, and they spend, say, a few days in one house and then a few days 40 miles away in another, then you think that looks as if it's okay?
That should be okay, I think, yeah.
One from John Moore in Bristol. Quite a few questions of a similar nature to this. We live in Bristol, he says. We have a son at university in Leeds. Now, both are in Tier 3. Can we go to Leeds, pick him up, bring him back to Bristol for Christmas, and indeed then drop him back after the vacation?
I think they can. So travel for Tier 3, people are meant to avoid travel except where it's necessary and to reduce the number of journeys. So clearly picking up a student for Christmas I would think, is counted as necessary because it avoids putting people on public transport. So as long as they're going there, picking him up and bringing him straight back, then I would think that is acceptable, yeah.
Right, OK. Hugh Pym's on the line now, a health editor as well. And this is one for you, Hugh, comes from Iona Wibberley in Stratford-on-Avon. My 83-year-old mother is in a care home suffering with dementia. I now find that my own area is to become Tier 3. My mother is in Tier 2. Can I still visit her?
Well, I think the key thing is whether the care home has arrangements for visitors. It's often going to be outside through a window. There are going to be tests rolled out across care homes in England, but maybe not till the new year, allowing a rapid test of somebody visiting a loved one in a care home and in circumstances being allowed to go in. But I would assume from this that Tier 3 going to Tier 2, going to an indoor venue to see anybody is not allowed. So I guess it's up to the care home, but if it was outside, and it sounds terribly cruel to say it, but this is what's having to happen, you have to communicate through a window from outside. I've seen that happening. Then that is possible, but do check with the care home.
Yeah, and the broader point, Tom Solomon, which you touched on already, is this business of going from Tier 3 to Tier 2, which you think in those circumstances, or indeed Tier 3 to Tier 3, when the travel seems to be necessary, you think that you can do it?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, people will interpret necessary in different ways. And I think people should ask themselves two questions with a lot of these, because some of it is the law, legislation. I think it will be legislated this week. Some of it is advisory. And I think you have to ask yourself two questions. One, if I was stopped by the police, do I feel I could give an adequate explanation? But perhaps two more.
Oh.
The virus to
hang on a second, we lost you there, Tom. Start again, because we lost you. Well, don't start again, but we lost the two more.
So I think the critical things are, one, could you justify what you're doing if you were stopped by the police?
Yeah.
And then it's ultimately in a court of law. And then two, more importantly, if the 83-year-old woman got sick and you'd actually taken the virus to her because you'd travelled across the country and visited with her in the care home, how would you feel then? And would you feel, gosh, I wish I'd just, held back for another few more weeks till these vaccines came?
And we'll move on to another section now, and that's lots of people have been asking us questions about pubs. So let's begin with Martin Rogers from County Durham. And he wants to know, I think this is one for you, Hugh, what's the factual evidence that transmission in hospitality businesses which have implemented great measures to restrict transmission is higher than in surrounding households?
Well, there have been various studies on this, but the basic point that's always being made by health officials is that indoors, particularly in winter, if the windows are closed, then the virus is very easily transmissible if you are in quite a large group of people indoors, and that the risk factor is very high, that if you're standing close to somebody and talking, maybe having to raise your voice, that there is a very high risk of transmission. And I mean, one example was the ski resort in Austria, where it was thought back in March that there were super spreader events because of people gathering in winter indoors in hot, crowded areas without any ventilation. So I think based on what we know about transmission of the virus, the theory is being indoors close to other people is not a good idea. But the rules do allow, certainly in Tier 2, for members of the same household to go into a hospitality venue as long as they have a substantial meal with it. That is still allowed.
And we've got a question from Tom Brockhart from Oxfordshire. And Tom, perhaps you'd like to have a look at this one. And he says, can anyone explain how, it quotes, the science indicates that if I have fish and chips with my glass of beer, I'm less likely to either spread or catch the COVID-19 virus than if I simply have a glass of beer? He's referring to the rules on pubs having to serve a meal, isn't he?
Yeah, that's a clever and perhaps a rather mischievous question. It's not about the fish and chips. It's about behaviours associated with eating and drinking versus behaviours when people are just drinking alone. And as Hugh was just saying, in the hospitality business, in pubs, etc., where people are drinking, they get close together. Pubs tend to be noisy. People have to shout. We know that increases transmission of the virus. And so it's really about the difference of behaviour when people have a meal, sit down and have a meal, versus when they're just out having a drink.
I live in Tier 2, says Leslie McCall in East Sussex. Can I meet my teenage grandchildren, who also live in Tier 2, at a shopping centre which is in Tier 3 so that we can Xmas shop together? Tom?
I think the guidance is clear that you should avoid travel to a Tier 3 area unless it's necessary. And whereas visiting an elderly relative who perhaps hasn't seen anyone for weeks might be considered necessary, it's hard to explain. I think you'd struggle to explain why you have to do Christmas shopping in this particular place in Tier 3, unless there are no shops at all in the whole of East Sussex. But I think there probably are.
All right. Well, that sounds like pretty firm no. Sarah Brampton.
I was just going to add something, Justin, very quickly. You're not supposed, even in Tier 2, meeting somebody else in Tier 2, to meet anybody in an indoor venue. You could walk into the shopping centre separately, but you're not supposed to meet them indoors. Slightly grey area, but any forms of meeting in indoor public spaces is not permissible in Tier 2.
All right. Sarah Bampton in Cambridge asks, over the 5-day easing of the restrictions over Christmas, do the rules of indoor socialising in hospitality venues also get lifted? For example, she says, can our 3-family bubble go out for a meal during that time, or are we only allowed to socialise in our own home? Tom Solomon.
My understanding is that the hospitality laws are unchanged. So even though you can get together as a 3-family bubble in the house, you can't go out for a meal together in a restaurant.
Hugh, is that your view as well?
Yes, indeed, that you can meet in your household, or you can go out outdoors, but you can't go to an indoor hospitality venue even over Christmas with your 2 other Christmas bubble households, families.
And Hugh, we've got lots of questions like this one from Stuart Dutson in London, and he wants to know, can business lunches still happen in Tier 2?
Well, this was quite a controversial area before the national lockdown in England, wasn't it, about business lunches technically seeming to breach the spirit of people from different households coming and meeting over a meal, but it was allowed on the basis of business lunches. There's nothing I've seen in yesterday's regulations that seems to prohibit it this time around in Tier 2. So as long as what was permissible before November the 5th and the lockdown in England it was permissible, that seems to be able to continue. But I think it's worth studying the fine print on that one.
That's an interesting one. Can I just interject on that? Because I've just arranged to see someone for lunch. Now, very, very strictly, the restaurant said you absolutely, if you're not in the same household, you may not meet inside. We're meeting actually outside, in an outside area. I mean, there's real confusion about it, isn't there?
Yeah, there was a lot of confusion over the business lunches issue, and the actual hard and fast guidelines were never made completely clear, but it seemed that up to a point that they were permissible. Tom may have a different interpretation of it. If it was deemed to be crucial for business reasons to have a meeting in an indoor venue. But I think people do need to look hard at what is in the documentation this time round.
Tom?
And Hugh?
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. And of course, it does become a bit grey. What's an essential business meeting? And, I've heard of people who can't meet socially deciding that they need to meet urgently for business. So I think it is a bit grey. But again, I think I know my signal was lost, so I'm not sure whether these 2 points came across earlier. But the critical points are, could you justify it to the police? And also, if you had your business lunch with a friend who then got sick because you'd passed the virus to them and became very unwell, how would you feel about that? Would you feel actually you'd made a mistake?
I think those are good questions, aren't they? I'll be thinking about those. Hugh, what about this one from Kate Clayfield? She says, we're due to go to Cornwall for a holiday over New Year, but we live in a Tier 3 area. Will we be able to pay and take a test and travel if negative, like holidaymakers going abroad?
I think we go back to what we discussed earlier with Tom. Is the trip absolutely essential? I don't think it's in the spirit of the guidelines to make a trip from Tier 3 to Tier 1 because you want a holiday. I think any non-essential travel outside your region is frowned upon. If it's part of your Christmas plans and your Christmas bubble, then that is permissible. If you're bubbling up with two other households in Cornwall or whatever, then that would be allowed. If not, I think it's very hard to justify.
And finally, one for you, Tom. Laura Coots in London wants to know, do babies count in the rule of 6?
I think they don't count for the rule of 6. So that at least is an easy one.
That's good. Short and sweet. Well, we're very grateful to you both for your expertise and clarity, Hugh Pym and Professor Tom Solomon.
And just on that point raised by Kate Clayfield about travelling to Cornwall, etc., we did talk to the Transport Secretary on that very subject earlier on in the week, and he was absolutely clear about it. He said no to travel within Britain from Tier 3 areas. That was frowned upon, but he accepted that if you were going abroad, actually, you could, and there was nothing in the rules to stop that. That was his view, at least a few days ago. And it brings us to 11 minutes to 9. Before we go, a quick update on whether babies count in the rule of 6. You remember this was a question a few moments ago from Laura Coots in London. It was addressed to Professor Tom Solomon. He's now looked into it further and says, yes, they do in the rule. They don't in England. They do in other areas of the country. In other words, it is hugely complicated. It is worth going onto that website.